B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, July 10th, 2018. Trump gets his second pick to pack the Supreme Court with young white conservatives who will have an impact for the next 40 years. And Brett Kavanaugh is as conservative, radically conservative as they come. It's going to be a wild ride to confirmation, and I will predict here today that Brett Kavanaugh will be confirmed as a nominee to the Supreme Court with Democratic votes. The issue is when it happens and how much it impacts the midterm elections. Now, Brett Kavanaugh is a guy who is deeply respected in conservative establishment Republican circles. He has the Bush family imprimatur because, of course, he worked as a colleague of Ken Starr's to try to impeach Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. He worked in the George W. Bush White House. Bush appointed him to the Supreme Court. It took 3 years to get Kavanaugh confirmed. He was not a slam dunk. And during that time, he worked in the White House, and he was part of the team that brought us the war in Iraq, Guantanamo, extraordinary rendition, domestic surveillance, and a blight of other idiocy and insults, including, of course, the implementation of the Patriot Act and the police state that has emerged here in these United States. And he is a guy who argued, and let's put this in context, it was a law review article in the late 1990s as he was working with Ken Starr, the special counsel, who was an independent prosecutor, a different stripe than what Bob Mueller has authority for today. And Kavanaugh argued that a sitting president could only be impeached. He or she could not be indicted or tried like an ordinary citizen. And many commentators grasp that and say, wow, Trump has picked an insurance policy, because there's little doubt that whatever Bob Mueller tries to do to Donald Trump will be appealed, and it will get to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh will be pressed to recuse himself, but we've seen that Clarence Thomas, who should have recused himself in dozens of cases, has brazenly resisted that, and there is no penalty for a Supreme Court justice who doesn't honor commitments that he makes at a confirmation hearing. Now, let me take a moment to describe Brett Kavanaugh from my personal perspective. I am a recovering Catholic. I went to a Jesuit high school, St. Xavier in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I have great respect for the Jesuit education system and the way they helped me learn how to think. Now, the Jesuits would say that, well, Peter, you didn't quite measure up because you kept thinking and thinking some more and thinking critically. And good Catholic Jesuit products don't do that. You learn how to think, then we inculcate you with the Jesuit version of philosophy. And that philosophy is quite authoritarian, typically leading to Rome, but with a pit stop in Washington, D.C. And Jesuit-trained Catholics defer to authority, even as they believe that the Jesuit is the highest order of the Catholic Church and that they have this special insider influence. Oh, and there are plenty of Jesuit haters out there who'll probably have a field day with this. But I went to school with a lot of Brett Kavanaughs, and they're still like him. They're still active Catholics. They are pro-life. They follow the teachings of the Vatican except when it's inconvenient, like contraception. And it was interesting because Kavanaugh made a note that his Catholic community doesn't all agree on everything. And while the initial interpretation of that related to abortion issues, I think he was actually addressing the death penalty. Because the Catholic bishops, the Pope, they believe that their embrace of life before birth also applies to not taking a life of an adult, that the state does not have that prerogative under the religious doctrines. And so Kavanaugh will carve out a little exception there, but beyond that, he will be a loyal, God-fearing, strict constructionist, an originalist of the Constitution. And as Trump said, he actually is the next generation of Antonin Scalia. Now, what's going to happen? Well, first of all, I want to note the composition of the court because my headline today reads, Trump preserves the Catholic majority. And I looked it up. There are 3 Jews on the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, and Elena Kagan. And now all the rest were raised Catholic. The one exception, you might call him a wobbler, is that Neil Gorsuch, who went to the same Jesuit high school, Georgetown Prep, as Brett Kavanaugh. They were 2 years apart. He now attends an Episcopal church, and I haven't heard a declaration of whether he still considers himself a Catholic. But what's notable is that Trump did not pander to the evangelical right. Now, Kavanaugh is approved by the Federalist Society, so all of the right-wing knuckle-draggers can assume that he meets their standards of being pro-death penalty, pro-corporate, anti-abortion, anti-gay, and pro-government power, pro-deep state. And so there is going to be a big skirmish. But it's mostly just for political show. The skirmish is going to be about really rallying the base of each political party for the November midterm election. And you've got the Koch money behind the Judicial Crisis Network. They're already planning to spend $10 million to promote Judge Kavanaugh. And the Democrats, well, they have about half as much money behind the Demand Justice Group, which appears to be closely linked to the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, because its executive director is Brian Fallon, who was a top campaign staffer and goes way back with Hillary Clinton. This also gives rise to rumors that Hillary is gearing up to run again in 2020. And this battle of the Supreme Court confirmation prior to the midterm elections may be a point where she tries to insert herself back into the public debate. There's also Indivisible, one of the groups of the so-called resistance, and they are going to deploy activists to show up at district offices of senators, demand that they oppose the confirmation of Kavanaugh. And we also are going to see a very firm divide in the Democratic Party. Polling shows that where Heidi Heitkamp represents people, she's the alleged Democrat senator from North Dakota, 68% of polled voters want her to vote to confirm Trump's nominee. And in Indiana, the number is 56% who want nominal Democrat Joe Donnelly to do the same. Then you've got Doug Jones, who's only voted with the Democrats a handful of times since he squeaked into the Senate by defeating the pedophile Roy Moore in that special election. And so this is going to divide the Democratic Party. And no matter what Chuck Schumer says about how hard he's going to fight this, he has already lost because of the defectors in his own ranks. And so I want to see the nomination blocked. I'd love to see the Democrats really go totally postal and stand up and say no and keep their ranks unified. But it's a lost cause. Now, there are a couple of Republicans, like Rand Paul, who was very clear with Trump that he could not support Kavanaugh. But Susan Collins of Maine, who said that she couldn't support a nominee who's hostile to Roe versus Wade. She's made comments to the effect that I don't see that he is unqualified in any way. Now, we can be relieved that Bill Pryor of Alabama was not the nominee, and also that Amy Coney Barrett, who came out of Notre Dame Law School and was put on the court last year, a federal bench, and she's the one who, is really deep into the God Squad. Now, there is one conservative Christian group, the American Family Association, which has called on voters to oppose Kavanaugh's nomination, citing concerns about his positions on religious liberty and abortion. He is not conservative enough for them. But they'll fall into line. You can be sure of that. And here is a deep data dive published in the Washington Post today under the byline of Elliot Ash, who is at... I can't read it because of the way it printed out, ETH Zurich. He is an assistant professor of law, economics, and data science. And he and his colleague Daniel Chen say, according to a deep data-driven survey of his writings from the bench, he is an uncommonly partisan judge, even compared to other federal appeals court judges. On the circuit court, Kavanaugh tended to dissent more often along partisan lines than his peers, especially during election season. He justified his decisions with conservative doctrines far more than his colleagues, citing politicized precedents consistent with other Republican-appointed judges. And as I alluded, Kavanaugh's divisiveness ramped up during campaign season. He disagreed with his colleagues more often before elections, suggesting that he feels personally invested in national politics. Well, he was a political animal, and all he did was put on a robe. And they conclude, on the evidence derived from the contents of his decisions, he is more radical than his colleagues. Now, he is opposed to Obamacare, but when it came before his bench, he appeared concerned that a decision striking down Obamacare could endanger Republican plans to privatize Social Security. Yes, he is still a political animal. His dissent in U.S. Telecom Association against the FCC, the net neutrality case, says he'll be sympathetic to the corporate-driven version of the First Amendment. And there are many other cases, including the recent one that is so troubling, where Trump administration officials tried to block an immigrant girl, a teenage woman who was detained and pregnant near the southern border, and they were trying to prevent her from obtaining an abortion. And he did some real convoluted legal arguments to dissent in a case where his colleagues did order that the abortion should go forward. It's also important to note that the Federalist Society has had an outsized role, and Trump has run this like a beauty pageant. And the Federalist Society were the state-level pageants that produced the finalists. And it's a pretty ugly process, because Trump just gave up any personal control and said, well, you picked them because this is going to benefit me politically. And in my San Francisco Chronicle, the esteemed journal reporter on legal affairs, Bob Agelko, described it as outsourcing the selection process. And here's the real stinker. Now, there are so many odious things about Brett Kavanaugh, but as you know, I care a lot about the Fourth Amendment. And Justin Amash, who's one of the few Republicans, he's a Michigan congressman, who stands up for the Fourth Amendment, he has denounced the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh, a disappointing pick, he says. The government's, and he cited a 2015 opinion written by Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit that found the government's metadata collection program is entirely consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Now that is an outlandish statement just on the face of it. And Amash classified that as a rubber stamp for the executive branch. He tweeted, future decisions on the constitutionality of government surveillance of Americans will be huge. We can't afford a rubber stamp for the executive branch. And Amash tweeted out a quote from one of Kavanaugh's rulings, quote, government program for bulk collection of telephony metadata serves a critically important special need, preventing terrorist attacks on the United States. In my view, that critical national security need outweighs the impact on privacy occasioned by this program. Now, that is just such bullshit. We don't have any public evidence that the collection of Americans' metadata from phone calls, the recording of those phone calls by the NSA, there's no indication that any of that has protected a single American from some sort of dastardly terrorist plot. If I'm wrong on that, please correct me. But I can't think of a single case. My email is peter@peterbcollins.com. Here in San Francisco last week, a federal judge gave a stern lecture to an FBI agent and his law enforcement bosses. The FBI agent, whose name is Stoney Carlson, was investigating allegations of credit card fraud, and he picked up a cell phone that one of the suspects dropped while he was running away. He got a warrant to search that cell phone, and then he got a warrant for what is described as a cell site simulator. We know that as Stingray. But the problem was, a federal judge said the California law prohibits state and local courts from issuing warrants to federal officers, a fact that was apparently unknown to the agent, the FBI, and possibly even the judges who approved the warrants. Wonder if Brett Kavanaugh knows about this. The law authorizes state courts to issue search warrants to peace officers, who include police, sheriff's deputies, other state and local law enforcement, but not federal agents. And this is the stern ruling from U.S. District Judge Vince Chabria here in San Francisco. And I support his opinion. There is also the important Supreme Court ruling that got buried at the end of the session. And I've linked to a commentary by UC Berkeley law professor Catherine Crump that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle. She writes, in the rush at the end of June, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered privacy advocates a win by concluding that the government is constitutionally required to get a warrant when it wants to access your telephone location records. And this, of course, under the USA Freedom Act, is no longer collected by the NSA. It is held by the phone companies, and the NSA has to ask for them. And it's a huge impediment because last year they only asked for 534 million call records. And now the NSA is deleting all of the stuff they collected because they broke the law of the USA Freedom Act. So this commentary by Professor Crump goes on to say that even when a statute might require the government to get court approval, this is done wholly in secret and wholly one-sided. Judges simply may not notice what looks like a minor change in a government application is actually constitutionally significant. So it's not an adversary proceeding. And while I support the Supreme Court's decision, and I support the NSA destruction of the records that it illegally collected, we are no more safe from unwarranted search and seizure than we were before. And the other day, I got a fresh missive from my friend Russell Tice. Russ Tice was one of the early NSA whistleblowers, and not a single thing that he exposed has been proven false. He writes, this was, by the way, in reaction to a lengthy article in The Intercept about 2 weeks ago now, where they identified each of the locations around the country where phone companies allow the NSA to divert telephone and internet traffic so that the NSA can capture it. And Tice writes, what I found out in 2004 was that NSA was illegally and unconstitutionally spying on all U.S. international and domestic communications. As I told Keith Olbermann on his show January 21st, 2009, it didn't matter if you were in Kansas talking to your Aunt Molly in Oklahoma. NSA was monitoring all communications. And he says that he predicted to Olbermann that it would be in 2015 when they could collect all of the phone calls, but they actually beat his prediction and opened the Bluffdale Collection Center in December of 2012. The tapping into the AT&T hubs was not NSA's limit. All the major telecom companies had NSA inject implanted taps at their large switching central hubs. Apparently, the only holdout was Quest, and we know what they did to the CEO. He went to prison on what we believe was a phony insider trading charge. The worst part is, even now after Snowden, NSA has maintained all of the shadow duplication network that they set up in 03-04, and it still covers that same call from Kansas to Aunt Molly in Oklahoma. NSA will claim that it must do this in case a domestic caller has previously had an overseas contact. But in reality, it's just a BS story to allow NSA to continue to collect and store all communications. The bottom line is that all the major hubs in the country and the shadow net are consuming everything right now. Anyone who believes NSA is telling the truth about abiding by the laws and the Constitution is a special kind of moron. A hopeless one, says Russ Tice. NSA is a gorgon, a Medusa, that must be destroyed, for it will surely be the lifeblood of the dystopian police state that supplants our republic. It is a domestic enemy of gargantuan proportion that constitutes a clear and present danger as intoned in the U.S. Constitution. The sheeple, both right and left, must wake up to this existential threat, else we are all doomed. And I asked Russ for permission to share this. He said fine, and I asked him also to comment on Russiagate and the FISA court, because I noted that the Republicans demonized the FISA court when they thought it didn't operate appropriately. But for the most part, nobody wants to explore the real mess and the unconstitutional goings-on of the FISA court. He writes, "The Russia deal is a smokescreen and the FISA court is a tool of the intelligence community, not its keeper. Trump is a loose cannon, and the IC apparently cannot control him. It is hard to use dirt against a man that everyone knows is already a colossal dirtbag." The DNC likely had an insider, Seth Rich, walk out with the info on a thumb drive and dropped it to WikiLeaks. Hillary and company found out and had him murdered for doing so. Now, this is Tice's speculation. And yes, the Ruskies use things like social media to attempt to influence our elections and other nations. And so does every other country on the globe, including our allies. But guess what country is the best ever at manipulating other countries' governments or doing some very sneaky Pete spookery to overthrow foreign governments? You guessed it, it is the US of A. Remember, Peter, I was a specialist in offensive information warfare whenever space capabilities were involved. I worked to support the CIA quite often. Our hands are the dirtiest of them all, and we spend countless hours on the Trump hater shows painting Putin as Satan incarnate. Trump and the right would do the exact same if the tables were turned. So that is some really strong commentary from Russell Tice. And one more in my collection of stories about spying and surveillance and that. During the holidays, while we were barbecuing and hitting the beach, the Justice Department reached a plea deal with Imran Awan. Remember him? He was Debbie Wasserman Schultz's special IT guy, and he brought in his brother and his other brother and his brother-in-law and his sister-in-law, and they were all grabbing big coin from the federal payroll. And we know that Imran departed for Pakistan, his homeland, after withdrawing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and he lied on a mortgage application in order to pull some of that money out. The plea deal is a single count of unrelated bank fraud. He had been charged with cybersecurity breaches, theft, and potential espionage. Now, along with the speculation you just heard from Russ Tice about Seth Rich, I have long wondered about Imran Awan. Was he an insider who got pissed at Debbie Wasserman Schultz and decided to leak some of her files? I don't know the answer to that, but we never will, because the plea deal has been struck. There will be no trial, there will be no evidence, and we will be left in the dark. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Paul L. Sesser, he's right there on the first of every month with a check in the mail. Larry Garner just kicked in some bucks from Boise, Idaho. Faith Peoples and Benny Alto are strong supporters of this podcast. Will you join them? Well, I ask that question, and often I don't get much of an answer. But maybe today it's your turn. You can afford $5, $10, $20 a month. You might even jump for the $50 annual subscription and get yourself a copy of John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University. All the action is at peterbcollins.com. Use the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber, then you land on the sign-up page, and you can figure it out from there. Well, today is the day that a San Diego judge set as the deadline for all of the immigrant children to be reunited with their parents. But Trump Co. is only getting about halfway there. They estimate there are some 100 or so of these children who are separated, and they're going to comply with the court deadline by only reuniting 54 or 55 of those children. And it's been such a mess. It shows that this zero-tolerance policy was not something that was well considered. They didn't allow the professionals to really set up systems to deal. They just decided to go for it, to create a new group of hostages to try to force Congress to pay for Trump's wall. That is the simplest explanation I can offer. Judge Dana Sabraw, Federal District Court in San Diego, set a deadline today, and the government said that of 102 that are now in custody, they are unable to locate more than about 54 of at least one parent of the separated children. A federal judge, this one in Maryland, I believe, Manhattan, is giving traction to lawsuit that challenges the inclusion of a question about citizenship in the 2020 census. And I am encouraged that maybe we will prevail and that data won't be collected. It'll skew the census and create just more mayhem for deportations and other dislocation of Americans. Meanwhile, 11 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay have filed a fresh habeas corpus petition that will be heard tomorrow in a Washington district court, maybe even Brett Kavanaugh's court. But the prisoners are being told that there are no facilities at Guantanamo where all 11 of them can be in the room at the same time and properly shackled to the floor. So they don't get to participate or even observe the hearing on their behalf. And these 11 people have never been charged, and of course, without being charged, you can't be tried. 2 of them have been cleared for transfer. But they languish at our gulag in Cuba. And as you know, this is something that I care deeply about. I hope they prevail, and I hope that someday they will be released. Trump has given pardons to the 2 men whose cases sparked the occupation in Oregon of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in early 2016. That's an incident that we covered in some detail here on the podcast. I was aligned with Sibel Edmonds at the time. She lives in Oregon. She connected me with some of the people I interviewed. And while I did not support the occupation by the Bundy family and their armed mad people, I did have sympathy for Dwight Hammond and Stephen Hammond. Now, they're ranchers, and there have always been issues about grazing on public land. They apparently set a fire to clear a certain part of their property. It spread onto government property, and they were convicted for this. And they served a brief sentence. They were released, and then the Obama administration resentenced them to lengthy terms, 5 years for the father, and I think, well, maybe the same. Maybe they both got 5-year sentences. So in some respects, I do support this pardon. But Trump, of course, has ulterior motives, and we cannot discount them. I want to recommend a couple of things for you to read. Margaret Kimberly wrote a great piece at the Black Agenda Report. I think it's a good analysis of the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in that New York primary and what it means for the Democrats. Our friend Kevin Gostola has published a good piece that I'm linking to at Shadowproof, backing up Glenn Greenwald's claims that people on MSNBC lie, especially when it comes to smearing people claiming that they're tied to Russia. Somebody sent me a quote from the proven perjurer, James Clapper, who I think is the architect of Russiagate. And he talks about the intelligence report that I trashed yesterday, the one that came out in January of 2017. He said, we showed unambiguously that Putin had ordered the campaign to influence the election and how the entire operation had begun with attempts to undermine U.S. democracy and demean Secretary Clinton, then shifted to promoting Trump when Russia assessed he was a viable candidate who would serve their strategic goals. But here's the whopper from the man who lied and admitted later that he gave the least dishonest answer he could think of when Ron Wyden asked him how many millions of people were under surveillance. But Clapper wrote in his new book, I don't believe our democracy can function for long on lies, particularly when inconvenient and difficult facts spoken by the practitioners of truth are dismissed as fake news. I know that the intelligence community cannot serve our nation if facts are negotiable. Yeah, right. Trump went to Montana last week. The Washington Post says that of 98 statements he made, 76% were false. 45 were false or mostly false, 25 were misleading, there were 4 unsupported claims, and 24 accurate or mostly accurate statements. False or mostly false statements alone accounted for 46% of all claims. And in Montana, Natalie Reel, one of our loyal listeners and a subscriber, alerts me that the Democrats have successfully run a lawsuit to force the Green Party off the ballot in Montana. I don't have all the details on the origins of the suit and why the court would rule to remove the Green Party, but the Green Party is extraordinarily disappointed. Here's a quote from a Green Party leader. The court has determined that the biased opinions of paid Democratic operatives supersede those of trained elections officials. It has allowed the Montana Democratic Party to violate the rights of more than 7,000 voters who signed the Montana Green Party petition, as well as those of the candidates represented. And finally today, Michigan has qualified 2 ballot measures, initiatives the voters will take a look at in November to try to fix the broken electoral system there. One ballot measure would require the Motor Vehicle Agency to automatically register people when they get an ID or a driver's license. Also, allowing same-day registration. Currently, there's a 30-day waiting period. And also, there's a separate ballot measure designed to address gerrymandering. Is there hope for democracy? Some people think so. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Feel free to share it far and wide. Did you know it's available on YouTube? I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.